Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We're really quite delighted that you could be with us as we have this really exciting conversation with Sophie Howe. My name is Michelle Maloney. I'm the National Convener and co-founder of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, and I'll be your host today. In a moment, I'll introduce our colleague Edward Morgan from Griffith University. But first, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples of North Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge the lands were never ceded and that the ancient practices and current traditions of caring for country continue. And with great respect, AILA and our sister organisation, the New Economy Network Australia, we're delighted to be able to live and work in a country with the oldest continuous culture on earth and play a part in sharing ways to be human societies that live for sustainability and future generations. Which brings me to the exciting topic that we're so delighted to be talking about today with a really remarkable woman who's had a very, very busy week. Sophie Howe, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've been everywhere this week. We've heard you on radio and TV. How are you finding your time in Australia?
Oh, I've had a brilliant, if not really intensive week. Been ably looked after by brilliant colleagues from Everygen and Griffith University and Foundations for Tomorrow and friends at the Centre for Policy Development. And hopefully some of the meetings that we've been having and raising the profile of the rights and interests of future generations will stay in the minds of some of those politicians and other influencers and decision makers that we're trying to get to act in a long-term way.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sophie. So our organisation, AILA, is part of an initiative called Green Prints, which is building frameworks for communities to bring all the good stuff together to actually make regenerative and sustainable transitions happen. So we're really excited that one of what we see as the core principles of sustainability or regenerative futures, intergenerational equity and future generations is our topic today. And speaking of intergenerational equity, I'd love to welcome Ed Morgan, a colleague at Griffith University, to tell everyone just before we go back to Sophie about the work that they're doing and why they were so fabulous as to bring Sophie to Australia for the rest of us. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Sophie, and thank you everyone for turning up. I'm Dr. Ed Morgan. I'm a research fellow with the Policy Innovation Hub and the Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University. I'm also a member of the Everygen group, which was convened by the Policy Innovation Hub. And we're working to influence the policy agenda and inspire evidence-based thinking on intergenerational equity issues in Australia. A key action is to showcase the Welsh experience as a potential model for a transformative path towards intergenerational justice in Australian policy making. And that's why Sophie's here and we're working her so hard. As you're all no doubt well aware, climate change, biodiversity loss, and a number of other pressing social and economic issues need our urgent attention. In the context of climate change, the latest 6th IPCC report has called for deep, rapid and sustained efforts towards carbon reduction. The science is unequivocal, and the report is a call to action and a code red for humanity. The good news is that we have multiple solutions and ideas at our fingertips, solutions that can bring with them a range of other benefits that address our other challenges, albeit with disruptions along the way as we transition. So what we're struggling with is how to implement these solutions and navigate towards a climate resilient future in a way that ensures no one is left behind and costs and benefits are shared fairly, bearing in mind the historical contributions to the problem. This is the focus of research in the Climate Action Beacon at Griffith University across 3 key areas that all need to happen together: motivating actions, enabling transitions, and ensuring justice. Action is finally beginning to happen here in Australia, but we've lost a decade and it's still too slow and incremental to really meet our commitments under the Paris Agreement, let alone stave off the major global disruptions that we're already seeing. So how do we change our approach? Is it revolutionary for a country to set compulsory long-term goals? Can we navigate towards a more just, innovative and sustainable society? Here we're going to find out what we can learn from the Welsh experience. Because in 2016, the Welsh embarked on a novel approach to public policy decision-making. They established the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and the first ever Future Generations Commissioner, whose role was to review public policy decisions from the perspective of the Sustainable Development Principle that recognises the needs of future generations. The Welsh Government also developed a policy capability framework to support officials in developing knowledge and skills and behaviours to implement the Act and policy in line with the Act. The Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations has a statutory role and sits across the whole of government. Their aim is to future-proof the policy-making domains and ensure public bodies actually think about the future impacts of the decisions we're making today. In a climate emergency that will have impacts for centuries to come, it is even more crucial that we recognise our duty to future generations. In fact, this initiative is a game changer that represents systems change, with the aim of taking challenges like climate change, cost of living, housing and health out of this contested area and into the realm of strategic long-term planning for the future. A future generations model is working in Wales, and every gen wants to think about how it can work in Australia. If Australia was to copy the Welsh Future Generations framework, is there a real prospect of moving beyond decades-long political climate wars, for example, towards a more holistic style of government and stewardship? We're excited and privileged to have the first ever Welsh Commissioner for Future Generations, Ms. Sophie Howe. She's just completed her 6-month term of office, and she's here to share her insights and speak about her legacy. Her term of office has shown what's possible. She has worked to connect Welsh policymaking with the principles of sustainability and well-being, shared best practice, and crucially made interventions in circumstances where decision-making was falling short of the long-term goals for Wales. A Welsh-style Future Generation Commissioner in Australia could support public bodies to really think about the long-term impact of their decisions, hold governments accountable for short-term thinking, and be the compass for changes needed to get Australia closer to our Paris commitments, our biodiversity commitments, and help address all of our other social and economic challenges. So we're really looking forward to hearing from Sophie and gaining valuable insights from this experience. So thank you so much, Sophie, and over to you both.
Thank you, Ed. That's a lovely preview to all of the good things that we're going to be talking about with Sophie today. So that folks can see Sophie, I'm going to take my Ed spotlight off for now, and I'll do myself in a moment too. Sophie, we have a number of lovely topics we'd love to chat about with you, and we invite everyone in our audience to, if you have questions you'd like us to put to Sophie for you, please write them in the chat at any time and we'll collect them. But for the next 30 or 40 minutes, please sit back and relax, and we'll have a listen to Sophie's experience in one of the world's leading strategies for caring for our future generations. So Sophie, perhaps we can just start with a really basic introduction from you about what the role of your work has been and the kinds of activities you've been involved in during your time. Can you share with us, just a bit of an introduction, and then we might dig a little deeper into some of the topics you raise. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me. Diolch yn fawr, Prando. That's Welsh, you might not be aware, but Welsh is one of the fastest growing minority languages, so we always try and to use it wherever we can. So I suppose the first thing to do is just sort of set out a little bit of background of what the law does and how that then relates to the role of the Future Generations Commissioner. So many of you will be familiar, I'm sure, with the Brundtland Commission, the definition of sustainable development, which is adopted into Welsh law. Which requires all of our public institutions to demonstrate how they're taking decisions in a way which meets today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It then sets out 7 long-term wellbeing goals, and these wellbeing goals were devised in conversation and dialogue with the citizens of Wales through a programme of work called the Wales We Want Conversation, a national conversation, and we posed the question there to citizens: what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children grandchildren and future generations to come. And they came up with a set of about 13 principles, which the government then looked at what was happening internationally at the time of the development of this legislation. The UN SDGs were in development, so we brought what the people of Wales said together with that international context. We came up with 7 long-term wellbeing goals for Wales, duties on all of our public institutions, including our government, to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of those wellbeing goals. So they must work beyond their boundaries to do that. So, you know, as I said, each of those goals, which cover a prosperous Wales, a resilient Wales, which is about enhancing and maintaining ecosystems and nature, a healthier Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, safe, attractive, vibrant, well-connected communities, a more equal Wales, which covers equality on the basis of gender, disability, race, and so on, and also socioeconomic disadvantage. And then a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language. Again, those of you who are familiar with the 3-legged stool of sustainability and social, economic, environmental well-being or sustainability, we have a 4-legged chair in Wales because we define sustainability as improving the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales, and hence that connection back to the goal of a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, and then a globally responsible Wales. Then a set of what are called ways of working, or a toolkit, if you like, for public bodies in terms of the way that they must now act. So they must demonstrate how they've considered the long term, both of the long-term impact of the things they think they're going to do, and the long term in their sort of setting of objectives and the actions that they're thinking of taking. That they should seek to prevent problems from occurring or from getting worse. They should integrate their actions, so recognising the connections between each of those wellbeing goals, different policy areas, and so on. Collaborate with each other across the public sector, and the legislation sets up some specific mechanisms to do that. For example, public services boards, which are a culmination of all of the key public services, and some representatives from the voluntary sector, private sector, and so on at each local authority level, with specific duties to set wellbeing plans for collective action, and then involving citizens in the decision-making process. The law then also establishes an independent Future Generations Commissioner. So I suppose it's quite a kind of cool description that the Guardian gave me, the world's first minister for the unborn. It's not actually an accurate one, because I wasn't a minister. I'm an independent commissioner, and my job was to hold government and others to account on how they delivered this legislation. The powers of the commissioner are to both advise and support public bodies on how they go about implementing the Future Generations Act, and particularly how they go about implementing or reaching those 7 wellbeing goals, and also to monitor and assess the progress that is being made in reaching those 7 wellbeing goals. And to do that, I suppose my toolkit, lots of convening people and developing and co-producing ideas of progressive policy, with the question, what are the things that we should do in Wales that will both deliver benefits to current and future generations and make the biggest contribution to each one of the 7 wellbeing goals. And perhaps I can give some more examples of those sorts of things in a moment. Also, lots of rolling up my sleeves and getting into the system and working out where the barriers in that system are. So if you think about the way in which the whole world really does, government and politics, and I'll, give actually an exception to that. Actually, in terms of many of our First Nations and Indigenous communities, who do tend to have a longer term view. But mostly the rest of the world, in terms of our systems, is endemically short term. It discounts the interests of future generations. It doesn't take a preventative approach. Generally, we only intervene in things when it's a problem or a crisis. You can take the pandemic as that. You can take, obviously, climate, that we're spending trillions and trillions of pounds and dollars on putting right the catastrophe which is already upon us as a result of climate change, rather than taking the actions that we needed to take 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago to prevent the climate effects in the first place. And so a lot of rolling my hands at working through the system and using our legislation to challenge the system on how it's changing in that way. A lot of calling out the madness of some of the things that government or our public institutions want to do. And perhaps we could get later into the first big test of the legislation, which was government plans to build a 13-mile stretch of motorway to deal with the problem of congestion. I'm sure you will recognise those scenarios and how they usually play out. And then a big focus in terms of really trying to inspire, cajole, encourage, show a pathway to a different way of doing things in Wales, a more connected and long-term way of doing things.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you for that broad introduction to what has been a rather immense shift, I suspect, in how governments are thinking. Could we perhaps jump into a couple of practical examples of how your role and how factoring in the well-being of future generations has enabled very specific differences in the ways decisions are made? You mentioned an important case. Did you want to give us sort of some practical examples for people? The audiences we have through Ayla and Nina and through this webinar would people from very diverse backgrounds and work areas. So some examples could be a great way to bring these systems change issues into reality.
Yes, of course. So the first big test of the legislation, well, let me just start by saying I can't force anyone to do anything or stop anyone doing anything. The powers in terms of, I suppose, enforcement, if you like, of the legislation are through judicial review. And the toughest end of my powers are what's called Section 20 review powers. So I could go in and review a particular decision that a government or other institution had taken, or review a policy area, for example, in terms of how well the act was being applied, make recommendations to that institution, who then have a duty either to follow my recommendations or to outline the reasons publicly why they are not following my recommendations and outline what they're going to do instead. So that's the sort of broader context. The first big test of the legislation, I suppose, and the role of the Commissioner was plans that the government had, which had been on their books for many, many years, to deal with the problem of congestion on one of our major motorways around one of our main cities, Newport, by building a 13-mile relief road. The plans for this relief road were to go through something, a nature reserve, a site of special scientific interest called the Gwent Levels, described as our Welsh Amazon, if you like. And the other issue with it is that they were going to spend the entire of the Welsh borrowing capacity, Welsh Government's borrowing capacity, on funding this road. So it was going to cost upwards of £1.5 billion to build this road. So I intervened in that issue because I believed that it was a sort of a test case, something that could set precedent, the first big issue affecting future generations, both in terms of how the government were viewing their obligations under the Act, how they were thinking about applying those 7 wellbeing goals, and the fact that actually, even though this, in my view, was a highly dubious thing to do, it wasn't, it didn't end there. We'd actually be asking future generations to pay the cost of doing something that was not in their interests, because it was borrowing powers. So I asked the government publicly to explain to me how they'd applied the Future Generations Act, how they'd applied the goal of a more prosperous Wales. And there's an important thing to pull out about our statutory definition of prosperity in Wales. So our definition is a productive, innovative, low-carbon society, one which uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change, and one which develops a well-educated population with the skills to enable them to access decent work. So I think you might be spotting immediately the omission from that definition of prosperity, which is any reference to economic growth, and GDP. And also you'll probably be recognising that our definition of prosperity very clearly puts prosperity within planetary boundaries. And so I'd ask the government to explain how they considered their obligation to meet that goal, because building a road obviously increases carbon emissions. We need to reduce our carbon emissions to meet our climate targets. Currently, about 70% of our emissions in Wales are from transport, and so how would they squared that? I also asked them to explain how they had considered the goal of a resilient Wales. So, advice from an Environment Agency identified that there was irreparable damage that would be done to the nature reserve, the SSI status, went levels by building this road. How also they consider the goal of a healthier Wales, because we have illegal levels of air pollution, we have increasing rates of obesity. So how were they applying the long term in terms of the long-term health issues for future generations, and how was this proposal going to help in that regard? And then how are they applying the goal of a more equal Wales, because 25% of the lowest income families in that area don't own a car. So we would be spending the entire of the Welsh Government borrowing capacity on building a road which benefits the already better off. So this played out quite intensively in the media. There was a public inquiry. It was very much pitched as an economy versus environment argument. And of course, I don't need to tell you how those arguments usually play out. The economy wins and the environment loses. The Conservative Secretary of State, who had been instrumental in getting this borrowing capacity for Wales, clearly wanted the road to be built, said that failure, the current congestion was a throat on the neck of the economy in Wales. The Confederation for British Industry were calling for my resignation and wanted my head on a plate, because who was this future generations woman daring to question this thing that we absolutely needed to secure the primary aim of everything in life, which clearly is economic growth. And cut a long story short, despite all of those interventions, despite a public inquiry recommending that the road should proceed, the First Minister of Wales applied the Future Generations Act and changed his mind, changed the decision, cancelled the road building programme, set up a new commission to look at, with the question, what are the solutions that we can find to deal with the problem of congestion, which best applies the 7 wellbeing goals and the requirements of the Future Generations Act. That commission has reported and has instead recommended mass investment in public transport infrastructure in the area, better walking and cycling routes, because that's good for health as well as emissions, and so on. But it didn't stop there, because what I continued to do was to challenge the entire Welsh Government's strategy around transport. It had been written in 2008, it hadn't been updated in line with the Future Generations Act, and I threatened to review the government on that, saying you now have these legal obligations for all of your policies and strategies to comply with the Future Generations Act. We actually work directly with the government, so although I'm describing a story of conflict in some ways and challenging government, actually at that point we went in and worked hand in hand with the government to rewrite the transport strategy to align it to the Future Generations Act. So the transport strategy in Wales now has something called the transport hierarchy. So this is, where do we start when we have a question of transport or new transport infrastructure, and the transport hierarchy puts walking, cycling, active travel at the top of that hierarchy. So that's our first port of call, and private car use at the bottom of that transport hierarchy. I then intervened further in how that was practically being applied on the ground. So you can see here that, yes, we have these mechanics of the legislation, but what we were seeing is that where our local authorities or entities were coming up with their solutions for transport changes, and asking government for the money to fund those new transport schemes, What they were trying to do basically is use the words of the Future Generations Act, use the words of the new transport strategy, but still make the case for building roads. You know, they were telling us that it's okay because you know, if we go faster, if we build this road, we're all able to go faster, then actually, you know, that will have some sort of impact on reducing emissions because we won't be stationary. They were trying to tell us that it was okay to build the roads because they were also going to build a cycle lane alongside it. They were telling us, of course, that the road was absolutely essential to the local economy and so on and so on. And I intervened again in the metrics by which they applied, or the criteria that they applied for their business cases into their traffic solutions by saying, show me not only how it's called the WELTAG guidance, the Welsh Transport Appraisal Guidance, which we'd work with the government to reform. Show me not only that you've reformed the guidance, but show me how your officials in government are really assessing adequately the way in which that guidance is being applied to these business cases. And I scrutinised a number of them and showed them where it wasn't being applied, and again threatened to review. The consequence of that is that there was a new announcement by government to put a hold on all existing transport schemes that had been improved in Wales and review every one of them. There were 55 of them, review every one of them in line with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. That review was recently reported. Almost all of those schemes, road building schemes, have been cancelled. The only ones that are going ahead are ones where there are specific safety improvements. And so in all effects, Wales has a moratorium on building new roads. I challenged them further on how they were applying their budgeting to that issue. So saying, on the one hand, when I scrutinise the budget, I can see that you've declared a climate emergency, and well done you, that's fantastic. And I can see that you're putting an extra £300 million into these new initiatives to tackle climate change. However, over here, I can see that you're still spending 2/3 of your infrastructure investment budget on building roads. So that one cancels out that one. So I want to see how you're applying your requirements, your statutory requirements under the Future Generations Act to your approach to budgeting. This was all going on at the same time as the reforms to the transport strategy and the WELTAG guidance. In last year's budget, we saw a reduction of 2/3 being spent on roads, down to 1/3, and we're seeing, hoping to see that kind of continued reduction with the roads moratorium going ahead. What are we doing instead? Well, the third that we've gained, I suppose, is being invested through a new infrastructure investment strategy aligned to the Future Generations Act. The majority of that is going into public transport and active travel. And the rolling out of new and innovative schemes. So things like electric bikes on hire, things like closing off school streets to traffic, and increasing the interventions and support for safe routes to schools. Things like on-demand bus services, where you can almost call a local bus in the same way that you might call a taxi. So we still have a long way to go in Wales, even in that area. But I suppose what I'm trying to describe to you is that fundamental change, starting from one big issue and how the Act applied there, to how that then transformed that whole policy area. And of course, the next iteration of that is seeing how then the transformations in policy actually then in turn translate into meeting our wellbeing goals, reducing our carbon emissions, creating more connected communities, helping to improve people's health, and so on.
That is just fantastic. Thank you, Sophie. So for those, I've noticed some folks have joined us a little late. We've been asking Sophie about some practical examples of how considering the impact of decisions on future generations has then created these systems change. And this example of, should this massive new road go ahead through a nature reserve, turns into much more than a yes/no question, and definitely goes into these broader systems change activities. So we might come back to some more practical examples. Sophie, we've got some lovely questions actually. Someone's saying that something's freezing. Can I just remind everyone that Sophie is being kind and joining us via Zoom in a room between other important meetings. So if you're having trouble, I'm not. If you're having trouble with your Zoom, it might be your own system. So we apologize if you're having difficulty, but we're hearing Sophie clearly and it's all going okay. And this is being recorded. So if anyone does have any hassles and you can't catch up with some of what she's saying live, we'll be able to make this recording available next week for you. Sophie, I wonder if now we go back a little bit and talk about these underpinning structures that have been built into the work of the Future Generations Commission. You mentioned the well-being principles or objectives, and I've got some questions from folks about, which are really important, and I'll jump to them soon after we talked about the foundations. Questions about how did you guys make this happen? How did you get the bipartisan support? So please hold, folks, we will get to those questions. They're so important. And in Australia, we're always so keen to make these important processes bipartisan. And as many countries find, it's very difficult to do. But can we go back just one step? I'm fascinated by this idea of actually having these well-being goals or well-being principles. And I'm just going to put in for everyone who's at home on Zoom, that is a link to a page that I might just bring up and ask Sophie a little bit about, which is the 7 well-being goals. You mentioned, and again, we'll come back to the creation of this entire commission through its legislation. But on this webpage, Sophie, we can see the well-being of Future Generations Act of 2015, the process getting to that, which we're all very excited to know more about. It says, giving us the ambition, permission, and legal obligation to improve social, cultural, environmental, and economic well-being. Here in Australia, the New Economy Network Australia is working with others exploring well-being economics, which is really coming to the fore as an alternative framework to growth capitalism. It's very interesting to us that you guys are already building these institutional structures on well-being. And for those who've not familiarized themselves with the website or the information about Sophie's work, I'll just bring up, these are the 7 well-being goals. Sophie, did you want to tell us a little bit about, you mentioned the process for how these goals were reached, but tell us a little bit about what they mean to you and your people in your place and your culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, they were reached in dialogue with the citizens of Wales. There were about 13. The way in which we went about that is, as I said, we posed this question: okay, try and get out of your here and now, and put yourselves into what you want your legacy to be for your children and your grandchildren. And the things that people felt were really important, the sort of natural landscape and the natural environment of Wales is, if you haven't been, perhaps, in fact, I was talking to a young Indigenous man yesterday who said that he showed some pictures of some of our natural environments, and he said it reminded him very much of home. So we are absolutely rich in our natural environment, but some of, much like here, much of that has been depleted over a number of years, and we haven't looked after it. We have, real challenges in terms of pollution in our rivers and so on. And people felt really strongly that we needed to put in place action to protect that and put that right. People felt really strongly about the sense of community in Wales. We like to have a bit of friendly banter with the English. The Welsh are much more friendly than the English, and a sense of community to the Welsh is really, really important. And there was a feeling that perhaps we had lost some of that our communities, the way in which they've been planned, designed, and built, didn't facilitate that connection. We felt that actually people looking after each other was really important. We felt that equality and social justice and a sense of fairness was important. And we also have a really strong connection to our culture, our heritage, and our language. And so those were the sorts of things that the public were saying, which were then formed into these 7 well-being goals. But I think the magic starts to happen really not when you perhaps, some of the goals are innovative in their own right. That goal of a prosperous Wales very much taking us away from a growth-focused mindset to a well-being economy. But actually the magic starts to happen when people start making the connections between those goals. And that is what we're starting to see in Wales. So that's so important because, if you take, that people said they wanted a healthier Wales. And that is about creating the opportunities which maximise people's physical and mental well-being, health and well-being. Now, the connections back to that are, they are about whether we also meet that goal of a prosperous Wales and have decent jobs, not just any old jobs, decent jobs. They're fundamentally about living conditions and planetary health. So they're also about whether we meet that goal of a prosperous Wales in terms of, are we acting within planetary boundaries? Are we reducing our carbon emissions? Really clear links again to human health and nature and our ecosystems, which in the long term, we don't protect our ecosystems. And actually, even currently, I was reading something the other day about the degradation in our ecosystems in terms of how that is playing out in the production of rice, actually already making people protein deficient and so on. So the quality of our food already is declining because of the way in which we have mishandled and damaged nature. So a really clear correlation there. If we think about a Wales of cohesive communities, living in a community which is cohesive, which has a, delivers a sense of community, which helps you to build relationships, which tackles loneliness and isolation, that's actually about 19% of what makes the difference in terms of life expectancy. And so those connections are critically important. So what we need to do with these goals is do the things that contribute to as many of them as possible. So perhaps I could give you another practical example of that, because the Act applies both in what we decide to do. So first off, the big ticket items, the wellbeing objectives that our government and public bodies set. Then those wellbeing objectives are iterated through the specific action steps that government's going to take. That would be iterated through manifesto commitments in their programme for government. And then it's how we carry out those things. So the government sets objectives around health, around low carbon economies and various other things connected back to our wellbeing goals. Their manifesto, their election pledge said, we will build 20,000 homes. So that's good. You can see the clear correlation. Good housing clearly correlates back to those wellbeing goals. But how we go about doing that is the critical point, because we could build 20,000 affordable homes, which are not low carbon homes. And that won't be meeting the goal of a more prosperous Wales. We could build 20,000 new homes based on the way in which we used to do community planning and design, and create them all in far-flung, out-of-town areas where the only way you can access things is by car, or we could build them on the basis of 20-minute neighbourhoods where people can walk and travel and cycle to wherever they need to go. We could we could connect with skills to make sure that in building those 20,000 homes, which we now want to be low carbon, that we developed a long-term skills pathway to give people access to decent work, building low carbon homes. We could go further than that and say, actually, we can see that there are big gaps in terms of inequality in the construction sector, and actually we need to have purposeful interventions to make sure that it is women, ethnic minority people, those furthest from the labour market, those most disadvantaged, who are able to develop the skills to enable them to access the decent jobs that we're creating by building these homes. So I hope what I'm kind of trying to explain here is that holistic nature of it being applied to what we do, and then how we decide to do that being as critical in a way. And I think that's where so much public policy goes wrong. You see these big ticket commitments, and then that one big ticket item which is delivered is either delivered in a way which is actually going to might develop positive outcomes here but negative outcomes over there, or it misses the opportunities to be done in a way which is going to multiply positive outcomes. So I come at that from a well-being and sustainability and future generations perspective. But you know, if you come from a financial perspective, if you come from an audit perspective, if you come from a treasury perspective, you should be looking to do those things anyway, because that's a sensible way of spending public money to get biggest bang for your buck.
No, thank you, Sophie. Again, an excellent overview of the complexity of not just the words on the paper or the definitions of the wellbeing issues, but how you apply them and how you think them through. Sophie, I'd like to just read out a couple of the questions we've had. They're actually connected, but I'd like to honour the words of the folks who've written them to you. And this is really about how did Wales get to this point where these fantastic ideas like living within planetary boundaries, connecting to wellbeing as opposed to just growth economics, all the things that many of us are working hard to do here in Australia have actually gotten traction in government. So here are the questions. Chris has said, what was the political pathway to get the impetus for the change, to ensure it has ongoing cross-party support and community backing? How did you get there in the first place? And Claire, very similarly, has said, what were some of the things that best helped facilitate getting fundamental change into focus? And connected to this is, what are the strategies you found helpful to overcome resistance and opposition? So there's questions about the pathway to get there. How did you handle resistance and opposition? And we might come back to that question later where, for example, the road, where the decisions were pushed and changed. How did the pushback from construction and others come to you? Now, because you're a clever lady, I'm going to throw one more comment at you from the wonderful Ian Lowe, who's on this call. And Ian has noted that connected to this bipartisan pathway, he says, following on that earlier question, our Commission for the Future, the Australian one, of which Ian was a director 35 years ago, never had bipartisan support and was defunded by conservative elements in the thrall of economic delusions trusting the market. Has the Welsh Commission got secure support? So Sophie, they're all connected, and yeah, we'd love your insights into how you got it there and how you keep it going. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So how did we get there? If you asked government officials, they would give you an answer which is about Wales having a long history with sustainable development. There was a clause in the Government of Wales Act which established the Welsh Parliament and so on, which required the government to have sustainable development as a central organising principle, and we've been on this journey and so on and so on. I'll give you the reality behind that, which was, yes, we had that clause. Did it make any difference? Absolutely not. It meant absolutely nothing at all. The Environment Minister was asked to report once a year. I actually worked in government. I was an advisor to two First Ministers and have been on the end of the phone calls in government where the Environment Minister's advisor says, oh, my minister's got to report this stuff into the Senedd. Can you get stuff from your department to say stuff that you've done on sustainable development? It was utter nonsense and a complete shower, really. As with many political things, there is something about often a person or a group of people in the right place at the right time. So we had an Environment Minister called Jane Davidson, who was a very experienced government minister, had held a number of different portfolios, including education and so on. Actually, the story for Jane Davidson, she had moved from the city to the country, had a small holding which she was personally trying to develop in a very sustainable way, had done a lot of travelling to other parts of the world to see where the best action was happening in terms of sustainable development. And she felt frustrated that we weren't doing more in Wales and that we should raise our levels of ambition. She brought forward some really interesting things. So the first plastic carrier bag charge in the UK, which was so controversial at the time, and now everyone just accepts. But she was frustrated, systems thinker, and frustrated that We don't just want more initiatives, we need fundamental change, and we're not getting there. Now, at the time, the UK, so the other backdrop to this political context is Wales has always had a Labour government since its inception in 1999. In 2010, a Conservative and Liberal Democrat government were elected in Westminster, and one of the first things that they did was to establish to abolish their non-statutory Sustainable Development Commission. So I'm not sure if your commission for the future was on a statutory footing or not. But if it wasn't, it sounds similar to what the Sustainable Development Commission was in the UK. And like your Conservative government, they abolished it. Wales always likes to be different to the UK government. Our second First Minister, Roger Morgan, talked about a clear red water, red being the colour of Labour in the UK, a clear red water between Wales and Westminster. And that was the policy agenda that Wales has pursued forever, really. So when England does something really bad, that spurs Wales on to do something definitely not as bad, and actually to do something even better. So political opportunism, and this is where I think you can make all of the valid arguments in the world about why these things must be done and are sensible. But you need to be tuned in to the politique réelle that's going on there, and be ready to seize those moments that you can't necessarily see coming. You have to have those relationships and be ready to go. So she proposed, not only will we not abolish the non-statutory commission that we have in Wales, we will put it on a statutory footing, and I will once and for all deal with these problems of no one taking any notice of sustainable development. And we will put meat on the bones of what we meant back in 1999 by saying sustainable development will be a central organising principle, and we won't just apply it to the government, we'll apply it to the entire public sector in Wales. So her getting an agreement with the First Minister to have a manifesto, an election pledge that we would do that, which simply said we will legislate for sustainable development. That went in the manifesto. Labour, as expected, won the election. Jane Davison then retired from government. So the new government were left with this thing that they had committed to do, which had been her baby, which they didn't really understand what it was that they were going to do with it. Cue there the massive importance of civil society. Initially, the environmental NGOs saying this could be big, there's a real opportunity here, and really forcing the government not just to sort of downgrade this because its sponsor was no longer in government, but force them to make it into something special. They convinced the government to hold this national dialogue. It was useful to the government because the government were kind of like, well, what are we going to do with this thing? I know what we'll do. We'll ask the people of Wales. So that was good. That was a good starting point. People of Wales told us what they thought, help us to frame these wellbeing goals. But what happened during that national dialogue was also really significant, both in terms of the passage of the Act and how the Act works now, which was suddenly the public health people sort of thought there's something going on with environmental stuff over there. Oh, hang on a minute. There's some quite interesting issues coming up about health here. Hang on a minute, this has the potential to be a public health act. We want a part of this and we want to be involved in it. And emerging interest around human and planetary health and the connections between the two. Over here, we had the cultural sector saying, this is quite interesting what's going on here. Culture aren't featured in it at all. They actually lobbied to be included as a sector in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Business, I have to say, thought doesn't really apply to us. It's a public sector thing. We don't need to worry about it until they start finding when the Act is passed that it's coming through their contracts and their roads aren't being built and all of those things, and there's a fundamental change. So it was, if you had set a pathway to do that, you could set a pathway, but you have to be there, able to take advantage of the political opportunities. And our big lesson through that is have that national dialogue and don't just keep it in the domain. As important as our environmental NGOs are and as important as you guys are, you have to be connecting more broadly if it's going to become a systemic thing. So that's what helped, that's how we got there. That was the political pathway. Strategies for overcoming resistance. Do you know what? In some ways, getting the Act in the first place, we were like a bit stealthy. taking advantage of those political opportunities, having that national dialogue, and coming up with a set of high-level principles, you know, having that public mandate, holding those community conversations in different communities, and so on. That gives it some sort of mandate. I think the stealthy part is probably because it only applies to the public sector. As I said, business probably wasn't that engaged. If they had realised what it would become, I'm sure we would have had much more noise, the same sort of noise that we had when it started to play out in terms of changing actual decisions. But you've got to build a movement, and you've got to inspire, and you've got to start from wherever people are at. If I could just give an example in terms of that issue with the road. So it was pitched as an environment versus economy argument. I happen to know that some of the things that were most persuasive to some of the politicians involved in taking that decisions were not the economy versus environment arguments at all. They were the case made, are you going to spend the entire of your borrowing capacity as a Labour government on something which benefits only the already better off? And what are you going to do about the 25% lowest income families who don't own a car? So whereas perhaps as environmentalists we come from a perspective of saying we must protect the planet, all of these things, actually having that broader lens and using that well-being lens to press the buttons that interest different people, particularly those decision makers, is a hugely powerful framework. As the actors develop, the sort of strategies for overcoming resistance have been the same. I have had some really public spats with business. I've also worked collectively and collaboratively with business. What was quite interesting is that kind of calling for my head on a plate in, it was about 2018, I think 2 years after I came into post. I should say, I think Edward said I was in post for 6 months. This would be an awful lot to do in 6 months. It was 7 years. So just in case you were wondering that, a verbal typo there, Edward. But so they wanted my head on a plate in 2018. Then by 2021, when I proposed a series of a COVID recovery strategy based around the Future Generations Act, with investment in transition into the green economy, investment in communities and various other things, the Confederation for British Industry wrote to the First Minister at that point endorsing my plan for recovery. So when you have an intervention where they might not like it, but actually they're going to have to wake up and smell the coffee, because if they want to do business in Wales, this is the direction that the government are going in, quite quickly they find opportunities to get with the programme and start working out, well, we're going to have to move forward, we're going to have to transition. How can we do that in a way which supports, low carbon economy and so on and so on. Wow. I'm sorry, in terms of the potential abolition, it's a law, so it's not to say you can't unpick laws and abolish laws. It would be very difficult to do that, and the politics of Wales, I think, would make that nigh on impossible.
No, thank you, Sophie. And we've got some lovely comments in there going, what a remarkable way that you've all together in Wales woven together these political opportunities with this progressive, forward-thinking strategies. We've got a couple of comments and questions about wellbeing goals, and I might come back to them. What we're particularly interested in next is, obviously, you guys have been working on innovative things for many years. We're curious where other organisations or governments that you've interacted with anywhere in the world are starting to do similar strategies. And from the Australian point of view, we have a very different cultural context to places in Europe. We are a colonial legacy country, and the First Nations peoples of this continent have their own governance systems, their own legal systems, and all the work we do has an extra layer of complexity and importance and sensitivity if we're going to build a different and better future. So I'm personally very interested in any stories you have of different cultures or countries or places and things you've encountered and learned and been inspired from. So thank you, Sophie.
So there is a lot of international interest in the sort of concept. I guess that's why I'm here at the moment. And there are some specific things in training in other countries. So the next country to legislate, well, so tiny little Gibraltar has passed a Future Generations Act. I think their population is about 50,000 or something. So, you know, it's very, very small. Very small context there. Scotland are likely to be the next, so we've done quite a bit of work, and there's, although the Scottish National Party have been in power for a long time in Scotland, there is a similar progressive sort of nature in Scotland as there is in Wales. So they have committed as an election pledge to have a Future Generations Act, which is currently going, is in development in their government. There's a bill going through the Irish Parliament at the moment. And there's a big move, and this is probably the most exciting area. Doing a lot of work, you know, with friends and colleagues across the world, including Foundations for Tomorrow, who are with us today, and others, to convince the UN Secretary General to commit to having a UN Declaration for Future Generations. So he has proposed that. That is currently being negotiated through the UN system. If that happens, that has real potential to have a kind of trickle-down effect to other countries across the world. However, what I'm also seeing is some good moves forward, but in a slightly disjointed way. So what I see across the world is there are a number of countries who either have or are getting their heads around future generations, acting in the long term, using foresight, future trends, and so on. So Finland has a parliamentary committee for the future. Lithuania has done something similar. Canada has a government policy foresight unit, which is actually the biggest one, the biggest set of infrastructure in the world in Canada, and also has a Sustainable Development Commissioner as part of their audit office. Canada is quite a good example of perhaps how you shouldn't do it, actually. I mean, I've got a lot of respect for Canada, and I would rather them do it this way than not do it at all. But you can see in Canada, they've got policy horizons and futures over there with government. They've got a person in government who's doing sustainable development and reporting on the sustainable development goals. They've then got, similar to what's happening here in New Zealand, treasury-led wellbeing metrics. They calling it the Quality of Life Index. How those three things join up, I'm not sure that they know how those three things join up, and how those three things not only will join up in government, but will filter down to become a way of being, acting, and a vision for the rest of the country. I think that's going to be very difficult to achieve. So I suppose my sort of advice to you would be, you've got there's a political appetite for change now, and you've got this new political context. So that's really, really important. You're pushing at a much more of an open door. You've got a treasurer committed to wellbeing budgets. That's a good starting point. It can start with Treasury. It must not stop with Treasury, because it'll only ever become a tick box exercise. And what we're trying to do here is get complete systems transformation and cultural change embedded. I suppose the other thing that I would just say is that small is beautiful, and you could potentially here, far be it for me to come from the other side of the world and preach to you guys, because you've got your own context. But I can see a few opportunities for you here. One, to work with progressive states or territories, perhaps to sort of model this out first, to look at that in a way which perhaps has this initial dialogue with the federal government, saying, you're developing a wellbeing framework, how could we be almost like a test bed and playing that out relevant to our own context in that area, but spreading that right throughout what the state government or the what they actually do. The other thing, and I'm acutely conscious of the sort of the sensitivities around this, but I met with the Assembly for First Nations People, the Chief Executive of that in Victoria this week, and there's treaty reform and so on in discussion there and likely to happen. And I think the challenge there is that what we're trying to do, or what you're trying to do, is to put right so many wrongs, or to address so many wrongs that have happened historically, and that is absolutely right. And there must be truth about those things before you can move on to the future. But there has to also be a future element to that. So I think that there might be potential in those discussions to almost run a local version with First Nations people of the Australia we want. Because what happened in the Wales we want was we had these sorts of conversations with Indigenous Welsh language speaking communities who in some cases have had very similar issues in terms of their language being abolished. Lots of horrific things happen to Welsh speaking communities, but actually doing mini conversations with them to say, what is the Wales that you want from your perspective? And then that feeds up to a national dialogue. That was incredibly powerful. And that's where things like the importance of a Wales vibrant culture, thriving Welsh language came from. That's where the importance of globally responsible Wales came from. That's where the importance of a resilient Wales came from, and that connection back to the natural environment. So there could be something there almost of your First Nations people actually being the forerunners on holding a dialogue about the future that they want to leave behind to their children, grandchildren, future generations to come. And actually my understanding of the history of Indigenous peoples is they've always been far, far better and more minded in that direction about protecting the interests of future generations than the rest of us.
Thank you, Sophie. Yes, and even now we have some very complex discussions and debates in Australian society about the voice to Parliament, much of which is looking back and looking forward. And in a context of Australia, we do have those extra layers, but I'm sure I speak for many people saying that it's very encouraging. It's always terrific to see actual examples of real bipartisan support for a future that we can all live within. So there are a couple of other questions and comments around practical matters that I'll come to in a moment, which I think will lead us back to some more examples, Sophie, of how this consideration of how the dots are joined up and how we think about the future can influence the decisions that you helped make and push for. Before we do that, though, what I was wondering myself is, what's next for the Commission now that you're stepping away? Did you want to talk a little bit about the future of the Future Generations Commission? And then we might come back to actually address some specific questions from our group. Thank you.
Yeah, so there is a new commissioner. His name is Derek Walker. He has a background working with social enterprises in particular. He took up post, I finished at the end of January, and he took up post the beginning of March. So what he is, I think, quite rightly doing at the moment is something that I did at the beginning of my term, was to sort of almost rerun the national conversation. So we had the national conversation to set the goals, and then to rerun that national conversation to say, okay, I pose the question, what are the things, the policy areas that if we got them right would make the biggest contribution to each one of the 7 wellbeing goals and are the most critical issues for future generations. So because you saw the scope of those goals, and one of the the warts and all downside versions of our situation or our experience in Wales is the government set up a commission, but an independent commission that didn't resource us effectively. So my budget was tiny, really, for the scale of the challenge that we faced. So I came up with a specific set of policy areas that I would focus on during my term. So they were housing, planning and transport, and then jobs and skills for the future, better ways of keeping people well, and tackling adverse childhood experiences. And the idea with those is that in each of those policy areas, there would be an application of what should that policy area look like if we applied each one of those 7 wellbeing goals? And so the transport, for example, was, exactly how we've, iterated that through. So Derek is about to start his own version of that. It's called Our Future Focus. He's having conversations with people across Wales to determine his priorities. And I don't know, so he's only been a couple of months in post. I don't know exactly how he will take it forward, but the good news is that he's there and the work is continuing.
Thank you, Sophie. That's terrific. So it's interesting, I guess, a reminder that even when innovative structures are put in place, now that you've got a new commissioner, you do go back to the beginning and go, okay, these are the goals we think we have. How do we continue to review, renew, and I guess respect the new thinking? So that's really great to hear. And I'm sure many of us will be watching it with great interest. And before we come back to some of these other specific questions, what's next for you, Sophie? You personally, you have been, I guess, under pressure in a way that many people could never imagine as a human being, taking on the burden of not just future generations, but an entirely new institutional structure. Where do you go from here other than a big holiday, I hope?
Yeah, well, at the beginning of my term, I literally had sleepless nights thinking, how are we going to make it happen? How are we going to make it happen? And, we still have loads and loads of work to do in Wales. Can I tell you that, every single decision in Wales applies the requirements of the Future Generations Act? No, definitely can't say that. In fact, one of the last things that I did was a review into the machinery of government to really look at how they're, in a detailed way, applying the Future Generations Act, and agreed a joint improvement plan with the government on that. But I can also say that some of the major policy transformations that we've seen in Wales, some of them were beyond my expectations, because I know how hard it is to kind of shift things. So I've talked a lot about transport, but I can also tell you that Wales has a commitment to be zero waste by 2050, and the way in which we're taking that zero waste strategy forward is by looking at where can we reduce waste, tackle, improve community cohesion, reduce poverty. So we're doing things like establishing libraries of things where people can borrow a lawnmower, a tent, or whatever it might be that they might need, instead of buying new, and using both the planet's resources and financial resources to do that. School uniform swap shops, so that old school uniforms not going into landfill. New parents aren't having to fork out a lot of money to buy a new school uniform, because it's being passed from one age group down to the next. Community repair cafes where volunteers are coming and repairing repairing your TV or your microwave or whatever it might be. Massive changes to our school curriculum, which are really, really exciting. There's 4 outcomes to our school curriculum, one of which is to develop ethical and informed citizens, which, if you just take that back to if we were all in an education system where we've been equipped to be ethical and informed citizens, we might be in an entirely different place now. So what am I doing? So I am working for myself, I suppose. My main mission is to try and get other countries to adopt future generations thinking, hence why I'm here. I'm working with some corporates in Wales, the progressive end of those corporates who are interested in how they can apply a wellbeing framework to the things that they're doing. And I'm also doing some work with the UN, and I've done some stuff with World Health Organization, and working with something called the School of International Futures, who are experts on foresighting and how do we embed future generations thinking. So still very much working in the same space, but now with a bit more freedom, not to have to worry on a daily basis about what madness might come out of a public institution in Wales that I might have to intervene in.
That sounds wonderful, and many of us will be wanting to continue conversations with you and others, particularly around how we can integrate future thinking into the work we do in Australia. So thank you for letting us know where you're going to be and what you'll be up to. Just cycling back a little bit to a couple of practical questions. Tiziana has a great question here about wondering if in the sort of the wellbeing principles and in some of your core areas, Was there any initiative that looked at clothing or food, given that both are everyday acts, and have there been any interventions in those spaces?
Yeah, so I mean, so the principle in the Act there is around the goal of a prosperous Wales, so using resources efficiently and proportionately. So our zero waste strategy is fully adopts the principles of circularity, and I gave some examples there. Beyond the school uniform one and broader kind of clothing swap shops and so on, I don't know actually what more we are doing on the clothing industry, and I probably should know, but just the scale of all of the things that Future Generations Act is covered. So I will make it a bit of a mission to go off and find out whether our circular economy and zero waste strategy covers that. The other area was food. So yes, food has had a big focus. So one of the things that's come from the Act, another good example actually of use it to decide what you do and then how you do it. So the what in this instance is Wales already provides universal free school breakfast to every primary age child, and is currently rolling out a universal offer of a free school meal, a lunchtime hot meal to every child. And the driver around that was around health outcomes, addressing economic inequality, actually educational attainment sort of benefits and so on. But we are now working with the government, or my office was working with the government and a range of other people in the public sector to work through the sustainable procurement supply chain and how we could embed a sustainable food system in the way that we supply the food to schools. And there's a lot of broader work, and again, interesting this one, that one of our economic agencies has set as their priority sustainable food systems. So they are working through that, which is quite unusual from for an economic agency to do that. So they're working at how can we procure the sustainable food supply chain to supply into businesses, corporates, public sector entities, and so on.
No, excellent. Thank you very much. Food systems are a huge issue, obviously globally, but in Australia, because of the impacts of agricultural practices, the food systems issue is a big one in both the wellbeing economy and wellbeing futures. Two more practical questions about things that have been going on in the work that you do. Chris from WACOS has asked a really good question, which I think touches on some of the work you mentioned about supporting children to have food at school and have brekkies. He's asked, can you give us some insight into how you tackled adverse child experiences? We do a lot of work on child poverty, sexual abuse, and domestic violence, and they struggle to get cross-government engagement in prevention and early intervention.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were, and in some cases still are, encountering exactly those same issues. So this work, interestingly, started in Wales with the then Minister for Children, and I'm going back to about 2012. And that Minister for Children, who implemented work on adverse childhood experiences, which I'll tell you about in a moment, then became the Minister who took the Future Generations Act through the Senate. So there was some quite nice crossovers, and he actually used the work that we were doing on intervening earlier and upstream to prevent childhood adversities as an example of what the Future Generations Act was aimed to do. So we've done a big piece of work with our public health agency, looking at really mapping the scale of, we call them ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. So to us, we define that as kids growing up in households where there's domestic abuse, substance misuse, mental health problems, parental separation or incarceration, or other forms of abuse or neglect. The long-term study that we did in Wales showed that 14% of our adult population had grown up in households where there were 4 or more of those ACEs, which is just blows your mind, really. And for those kids, when they were entering into adulthood, they were 20 times more likely to end up in the criminal justice system, 15 times more likely to to use drugs. Actually, we were even able to map that across a 3 times increased likelihood of respiratory disease, and so on. So the real health impact in the long term is significant. We also looked at what are the things that you can do to mitigate that, to prevent ACEs from occurring. So we heavily invested in early intervention and family services. We introduced a programme called the First 1,000 Days, which goes from the point at which a woman is pregnant to age 2 of a child, recognising that those are the most critical points of intervention. And then we started building kind of community responses, so involving all of our public services and beyond. So 5,000 police officers in Wales have been trained to identify childhood adversities. Our teachers are trained to identify childhood adversities and to respond to them, and not to put in place measures which re-traumatise children. Because, the kids who experience ACEs were also the kids who were getting expelled, which is basically a re-traumatisation. We even had at one point the Welsh Rugby Union on board. They've had a bit of a tough time recently, which I won't go into, so they are other ways focused. But we were even looking and did some small-scale programmes around how your rugby coaches could be trained up to identify the kids perhaps in their teams or not in their teams, who might be suffering with childhood adversities, because the evidence tells us that a protective factor from the impacts of those child adversities is what's called the always available adult, the trusted adult. So if those adults are skilled to spot, understand and react in the way which is going to provide that mitigation, then that's something that we want to do as a whole sort of community. Reforms to the school curriculum, really important in that as well, and some big interventions around young people's mental health, etc., etc.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sophie. We have taken so much of your time. I've got 2 last questions. Thank you so much. One is a very practical one, which a number of folks are asking, including me. How well was the Commission resourced? How many folks did you have working in your team or supporting you?
Not very well, not enough. And this was a constant bone of contention. However, my parting gift to my successor is that I managed to get quite a big increase in the budget, which was a lot of politicking and navigating and threatening this, that and the other. Anyway, but the budget was £1.5 million, which is absolutely tiny considering the remit and the responsibilities of the Commissioner and the areas which the Commissioner could potentially intervene in. That in itself played into some of my biggest frustrations about the role and about our ability to transform in other areas. There were so many things that we could almost touch, and we were able to prove that where my office, and there was about 30 staff, mostly because we were quite clever at begging, borrowing and stealing from other organisations, partnering with academic institutions who would do research on particular issues for us for free, having joint appointments and secondments with other organisations and so on. But there were so many things that I could almost touch and show that where we did intervene, often in a supportive manner, to rewrite transport strategies, to advise how you would embed a wellbeing approach on this, that and the other, the outcomes were much better, but we just couldn't get to them. And that led, in some cases, also to a frustration, sometimes amongst members of the public, sometimes amongst politicians, who wanted me to take up their particular issues, and we just did not have the capacity to do it. So hence why I set those 6 priority areas. But even those are massive areas. So within those, we had to, be very clever about where's what are the big concerns that we need to stop catastrophe happening, or what are the political opportunities for us to intervene and actually make something that was going to be okay from a wellbeing perspective really good. So those were the sorts of strategies that we applied.
Fantastic, thank you, and well done getting the additional funding. One question just quickly was, what percentage of the population in Wales do you think was engaged in those wellbeing conversations that helped it set up the Commission?
So about 10,000 people actively took part.
Wow.
Population of 3 million. So, you always want it to be more, don't you? But that wasn't the only point. So every time, so there are now 50 institutions in Wales covered by the Future Generations Act. Every time they set new wellbeing objectives, so the goals never change. I'm not saying never, but there'd have to be legislative change to change the goals. But every 5 years, the public institutions review their wellbeing objectives. They might keep them the same, or they might change them, and they have to have a dialogue with the public in terms of how they do that. So it's an ongoing conversation. You've got the new commissioner at the moment having dialogue around what priorities he should set for his interventions and his work. And there's a lot of infrastructure that has come up. Some of it before, but some of it since the Act. So the establishment of a youth parliament, an elected youth parliament in Wales, lowering the voting age to 16. Lots of other sort of things which facilitate that community involvement, but still it's not good enough. There's still more to do.
That's why we love your work, Sophie. You always want to be striving for even more. We might end on a really lovely, thoughtful note, actually, because Paul has said, how important is a spiritual change in our relationship with the planet in terms of bringing about change? And it's lovely to see him citing Thomas Berry, who inspires a lot of the work that Ayla is involved in. Sophie, final thoughts on how do we create culture change? How do we get all the good stuff building into that right direction?
Well, I think that spiritual, connection to nature and the land. I mean, there's a stat. I won't end on this stat because it's really negative. I'm going to end on a positive note. But there's some research which shows that these are US kids actually. Kids can name almost 10,000 corporate logos, but can only name like 5 native species of tree. And I'm like, what the hell have we done to our kid? What are we doing to our kids? What are we doing to our society and our planet that is the reality? And so we are trying to put that right. I'd really love you to Google Michael Sheen and the Brecon Beacons National Park. Or I could tell you the Welsh word for it, which it is now called, but you find it difficult to spell that. Because that is a live issue at the moment of how one of our national parks is transforming the way that it does things to connect and restore nature and connect people back to nature. And if you haven't had an inspirational day, watch that and you will feel absolutely uplifted. And then the final thing that I want to just say in terms of an anecdote which talks to that connection back of our kids to nature. So I told you our school curriculum focuses on being ethical, informed citizens, educating our kids in forest schools, finding ways to reconnect them to food growing and protecting and enhancing nature, and so on. And I was having a glass of wine with some school mums a few months back, and one of the mums said that her little girl, who's 8, Maisie, had asked for a whittling knife for her birthday. Now, that in just one conversation says to me about the difference that the school curriculum in Wales is making now. I've got a 23-year-old who's my eldest and an 8-year-old who's my youngest. And our school curriculum now for my 8-year-old is almost unrecognisable from the curriculum that my 23-year-old went into. Another mum actually piped up and said her daughter had asked for one as well. So if you're looking at metrics of the number of women working in nature, they're really low. And for our girls to be asking for whittling knives, that's really exciting. I'm not sure about merits of providing an 8-year-old with a knife, but that's another.
No, I want a whittling knife, absolutely.
And if you look at the connections there between, how our young people are thinking, that gives me kind of massive hope for the future, that the next generation of kids, because of these long-term interventions we put in Wales, will be coming forward and doing fundamentally better things that I, even you, or any of us have ever done.
Wonderful. Sophie, we will wrap up now. We've had you for 90 minutes. We're really grateful for your time, truly. And this recording will be watched and rewatched by many good folk, I think. I'd like to thank you for your time and generosity. It takes a lot to travel across the planet and talk and talk and talk and share for a very long time. And I'm sure your work will be ongoing. And there's some beautiful comments in the chat thanking you for an inspiring insight into your work, thanking you for being brave champion for the future and the present. Finally, I'd like to thank Griffith University, Susan Harris-Rimmer, Gwyn McCarrick, Edward Morgan, and all of the good folks who helped bring you to us, Sophie. And a final plug for the work we do. The Australian Earth Laws Alliance is passionate about building Earth-centered futures, but basically that's a life-centered future where the foundations of our ecology continue to support the diverse and wonderful aspects of human civilizations and societies. I've put in the chat there, if you're interested in the work we do in Greenprints, greenprints.org.au, earthlaws.org.au, and please, including you, Sophie, watch this space. Nina has been auspicing the beginnings of wellbeing economy conversations in civil society, and we're very, very interested in getting more and more people connecting into the civil society side of how we show governments what is good, how we can help, and how we can work together. So thank you so much, Sophie. It's been a really wonderful session. We're privileged to have your time. Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for all your time.